Buildings don't always tell the truth. Some stand with honesty, showing their structure, their weight, their purpose. Others whisper a different story. They pretend to be stone but are wood. They mimic history that never belonged to them. They paint skies on ceilings, or hold up facades with nothing behind them. They sell visions that never arrive. And sometimes, we accept these lies with joy. Sometimes, they betray us. This is a story about the truth and the lie in architecture, about how walls, towers, and drawings can shape belief, about how illusions live not only in our cities, but in our minds, and about whether a future of honesty in architecture is even possible. A building is more than walls, windows, and a roof. It carries messages, both intended and unintended, about what it is and what it wants us to believe it is. When we ask whether a building is true or false, we are asking if it is honest about those messages. The idea of truth in architecture often begins with function. A barn tells the truth when it looks like a barn, with wide doors for wagons and open lofts for hay. A cathedral tells the truth when its soaring ceilings draw the eye upward, reminding visitors that the structure was built to connect heaven and earth. These forms speak clearly. They match their purpose with their appearance. When the form and the purpose align, we sense that the building is true. But architecture is never only about function. Intention matters as much as use. An architect may design a building to shelter families, but also to express civic pride, or to evoke a past era. A courthouse may serve its practical role as a place for hearings, yet its thick columns and broad steps speak of permanence and authority. These layers of meaning complicate the question of truth. We may accept the exaggeration, because it suits the building's role. At times, though, the intention bends into something else. When intention drifts too far from what is built, the building may feel like a lie. Materials make this tension visible. Stone has long suggested weight, endurance, and seriousness. Brick suggests craft and durability. Wood suggests warmth and flexibility. When these materials are used honestly, they tell us about the building itself. Stone pillars in a Greek temple carry the roof. A timber beam in a farmhouse holds the upper floor. But when materials pretend to be something they are not, honesty falters. Plaster carved to look like stone columns, or vinyl siding pressed with a false grain of wood, tells a story that is not real. The deception may be small, yet it unsettles. We recognize that the material has been asked to wear a costume. This kind of substitution has a long history. In Gothic cathedrals, soaring stone arches created both beauty and structure. Later, when builders copied the style in smaller towns, the stone became wood, cut and painted to mimic the appearance of Gothic vaults. The effect fooled the eye, but not the mind. The viewer sensed the trick. What should have been heavy and solid was light and false. Some argue this substitution led to the decline of the style. Once the illusion became obvious, the trust in the design weakened. Think of walking into a modern restaurant built to look like a rustic farmhouse. Beams stretch across the ceiling, stained dark with what appears to be centuries of smoke. Yet if you tap them, you find they are hollow shells made of plastic or foam. The deception works for a moment, but the discovery of the false material changes your experience. You may feel misled. The place pretended to be rooted in history, but the truth was shallow. The building told a lie to shape your emotions. Still, deception in architecture is not always judged the same way. In some cases we forgive or even welcome it. Consider stage sets for a play. The audience knows that the stone castle wall is painted canvas, yet the illusion helps tell the story. The difference lies in context and expectation. On stage, deception is expected. In daily life, it is not. A false wall in a theater delights. A false wall in a bank may raise suspicion. In both cases the materials are the same, but the intention and the trust are different. The perception of truth and lies in architecture has shifted across eras. During the Renaissance, architects returned to classical ideals, celebrating columns, domes and arches not just for their strength, but for their symbolic value. The stone was real, and its use was honest. By the 19th century, however, industrial methods made it possible to mass-produce materials that looked like something else. Cast iron could be painted to resemble carved wood. Thin facades could be attached to simple structures to mimic grandeur. This was the age of facades, when appearance sometimes became more important than substance. In the 20th century, modernism pushed back. Architects like Le Corbusier and Ludwig Mintz van der Rohe argued that buildings should be truthful. They stripped away ornament and declared that less is more. Glass, steel, and concrete were left bare. Yet even modernism carried its own kind of lie. The promise of functional honesty often hid the social and political agendas behind it. A concrete tower might have been sold as a triumph of efficiency, but in practice it could become an alienating block for those forced to live in it. The style claimed truth, but the experience could feel like betrayal. Today, our relationship to architectural truth is even more complicated. New materials make substitution easier than ever. Full stone panels can be glued to the outside of a suburban home. Decorative beams made from light composites can be snapped into place in a single afternoon. At the same time, digital tools allow architects to show us images of buildings that look convincing but are impossible to realize. The boundary between real and fake blurs. We are left to decide which kinds of deception we accept and which ones feel intolerable. To say a building is true or false, then, is to weigh function, intention, and material together. A true building aligns its use, its purpose, and its physical form. A false building allows those elements to drift apart, sometimes gently, sometimes dramatically. We recognize the difference in how we feel when we stand inside. Do we sense integrity, or do we sense that something is pretending to be what it is not? The question will never have a single answer, because truth and lie in architecture shift with time, culture, and expectation. Or what feels honest in one era may feel dishonest in another. What seems acceptable in a theater may feel false in a church. Yet the search for truth remains, guiding both architects and the people who live among their buildings. In Portland, entire neighborhoods now carry the look of age without having lived through it. The company Renaissance Homes has made a business out of producing houses that appear historic but are in fact new. Walk down one of their streets, and you might believe you have stumbled into a pocket of preserved craftsman cottages or Victorian houses, carefully maintained for over a century. Porch columns flare at the base in the style of the 1910s. Shingles carry the staggered edges of early 20th century siding. Window frames show off muntines that divide panes into neat squares, yet none of it is original. These homes are not restored survivors from the past. They were built recently, with modern materials and modern techniques, but dressed to look like something else. This practice raises a question about the way nostalgia works in architecture. Nostalgia is a powerful pull. It makes us long for an imagined time when houses were sturdier, streets were friendlier, and life felt grounded. Builders know this. They tap into that longing by shaping houses that signal age, even when the substance is new. Renaissance Homes gives buyers the feeling of living in a neighborhood with history, without the headaches of repairing old plumbing or rotting foundations. It is nostalgia for sale, polished and ready for occupancy. The past becomes a commodity. Think about what happens in the mind of a family buying one of these houses. They walk through the front door and see a floor plan that looks like a craftsman home but with open spaces the original builders never would have designed. The kitchen sparkles with stainless steel appliances. The bathroom gleams with tile that mimics handmade craft but was cut by machine. The family feels both comfort and pride. They believe they are moving into something with roots, a home that carries cultural weight, yet they are stepping into a stage set. The home tells them a story that is not quite true, and they accept it because the story is one they want to hear. The manipulation is subtle. A neighborhood of truly historic homes carries signs of wear and change. Paint chips. Foundations settle. Trees grow older than the houses themselves. Renovations leave mismatched details that tell you the house has lived a life. A Renaissance home's development is different. Every facade matches too neatly. The faux vintage details are repeated with slight variation, just enough to avoid obvious duplication. There is no true history. What looks like the patina of age is sprayed-on finish. What seems like tradition is only a design decision. The emotional hook is clear, live here, and you live inside the dream of a simpler past. Some residents welcome this. They argue that the homes at least keep the character of the neighborhood alive. Portland, like many cities, has struggled with rapid growth. Glass and steel condos rise in place of bungalows. Developers level old houses to put up large, box-shaped apartments. Against that backdrop, a faux craftsman can seem like a blessing. It maintains a visual continuity, even if it is only surface deep. To many homeowners, the appearance is enough. If the street looks historic, it feels like heritage, whether the walls inside are drywall or plaster. Others see the practice as a slow erosion of authenticity. They point out that fake vintage homes flatten the meaning of history, instead of protecting real houses with real stories. The city allows imitations to stand in their place. Imagine a visitor walking down such a street 50 years from now. They might believe they are seeing a century of Portland's history layered in wood and stone, but they would be mistaken. They would be reading a fiction written by developers and accepted by buyers. Or when the built environment becomes unreliable, so does the cultural memory tied to it. The debate comes into focus when preservationists clash with developers. Preservationists argue that real historic homes deserve protection because they are records of their time. They show how materials were used, how families lived, and how cities grew. A craftsman built in 1912 tells us something about lumber mills, railroads, and immigrant labor. A replica built in 2012 tells us something very different. It speaks of marketing, nostalgia, and the economic appeal of style over substance. To treat the two as equal is to blur the line between record and replica. One can test this by considering a hypothetical case. Picture two houses side by side. One was built in 1920. It has been renovated over the years, patched, repaired, and adapted. The second was built in 2020 by Renaissance Homes, styled to look like its neighbor. From the street they may appear nearly identical, but inside the differences run deep. The older home contains original timber beams that were cut from forests that no longer exist. Its plaster walls were hand-applied by workers using techniques long since abandoned. The newer home hides steel supports inside walls of drywall. Its details were mass-produced in factories. Both homes may give comfort, but only one can serve as a historical document. To confuse the two is to misread the past. Developers argue that buyers want choice, and that these homes meet demand. They say a family who might not afford to restore an old home can at least enjoy the style in a new one. They point to energy efficiency, lower maintenance, and safer materials. From a practical standpoint, they are right. Yet the cultural cost remains. What is lost is not only an old house, but the link it provided to a specific moment in time. In exchange, the city gains a surface copy. The substitution keeps the image alive, but empties it of its original meaning. Communities feel this loss even if they cannot always explain it. Residents may walk their block and sense that something is off. The street looks historic, but lacks the uneven charm of real history. Every roofline is too perfect. Every porch railing is too clean. The illusion begins to wear thin. People live among facades that do not match their story, and the dissonance shapes how they see their city. The case of Portland's Renaissance homes forces us to think about what authenticity in architecture should mean. Is it enough that a home looks like it belongs to the past, or must it actually carry that past within its materials and construction? Does style alone preserve culture, or does culture require truth? When nostalgia becomes a product, the answer is no longer simple. Some will accept the trade, others will see it as a lie in wood and stone. What remains clear is that the debate is not about style alone, but about the honesty of the built world we choose to inhabit. In the ancient world, painters discovered that a flat surface could be made to appear deep, heavy, and solid. They learned how to fool the eye into believing that stone columns, carved moldings, and open skies existed where there was only plaster. This technique, known as trompe-l'œil, which means to deceive the eye in French, has roots as far back as ancient Greece. Writers tell us of painted grapes so convincing that birds tried to eat them, or curtains so real that guests reached out to draw them aside. From the start, painted illusion carried both humor and wonder. It was art's first open admission that trickery could bring joy. Centuries later, Michelangelo raised the stakes on this tradition with the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Visitors who crane their necks upward are not looking at real architecture. The columns, entablatures, and cornices framing the famous biblical scenes are paint alone. Michelangelo built a vast stone framework in pigment, convincing the viewer that complex architecture extends above them when the ceiling is nothing more than a broad vault. The deception is clear, but it is not hidden. Anyone who pauses to think knows the forms are painted. Yet the experience overwhelms that knowledge. The illusion commands attention because it makes the space feel larger, more ordered, and more divine than its physical shell. This raises a distinction between artistic deception and architectural deception. Artistic deception lives in paint, in sculpture, in theater. Its purpose is not to mislead about material reality, but to open imagination. A painted column is not trying to hold up a roof. It only asks the eye to enjoy the trick. Architectural deception, by contrast, hides in the physical structure. When plaster is shaped to resemble stone and presented as load-bearing, the deception is functional. It tells a falsehood about how the building stands. The difference lies in the stakes. Artistic deception entertains. Architectural deception manipulates. One is play, the other is disguise. Many churches embraced trompe-l'œil to extend their spaces. In the Baroque period, ceilings were often covered with painted heavens, clouds rolled back, and angels leaned over balustrades that did not exist. Andrea Pozzo's ceiling in the Church of St. Ignatius in Rome is a famous example. The actual roofline is modest, but his painting makes it appear as though the church continues upward into an endless dome. Visitors feel the presence of heaven above, though physically nothing has changed. The deception supports the building's purpose. The goal was always to lead worshippers' minds upward. Paint became an economical way to do so without building a true dome. Theaters also used these techniques to alter perception. In Renaissance Europe, stage designers painted deep colonnades and city streets onto flat panels. Audiences believed they were looking into a grand plaza or palace hall when in fact they faced only a few feet of wood. The illusion served the drama, drawing viewers into the story. Nobody left the playhouse demanding that the painted palace be real. The deception was accepted because it was part of the contract between performer and spectator. Palaces used trompe-l'œil as well, though with different motives. In Versailles, painted panels created the impression of marble, gilt, or depth beyond the actual room. The point was not only delight, but also power. Visitors to the French court were meant to feel overwhelmed by scale and ornament, even if much of it was illusion. The deception served politics by magnifying the king's authority. Unlike in theatre, the stakes here were social and cultural. To stand before a false column painted as marble was to be reminded of wealth and influence, even when that wealth was a matter of pigment rather than stone. The recurring question is whether delight is itself a lie. If a painted sky lifts the spirit, does it matter that the plaster above remains flat? Some would argue that the pleasure of the illusion is enough. It achieves a higher kind of truth, the truth of feeling. A church ceiling may not open to heaven, but it makes a worshipper feel closer to heaven. A palace wall may not contain real marble, but it makes a guest feel the intended awe. In these cases, the deception is not malicious. It serves the function of the space by enhancing its meaning, yet unease lingers. Imagine walking into a theatre where the painted columns suddenly become structural. The roof is supported not by stone, but by beams dressed in pigment to look like marble. At that moment, the deception crosses into something more serious. The pleasure turns to mistrust. The distinction between painted delight and material lie matters because it defines the terms of the experience. We accept one because it invites us into imagination. We resist the other because it undermines trust in the physical world we inhabit. The endurance of trompe-l'œil suggests that people are willing to live with certain lies when those lies give them something in return. Churches gain a sense of the divine. Theaters create worlds on a bare stage. Palaces project power greater than their budgets might allow. The painted illusion becomes a partner in the experience, not an obstacle. The viewer is not a victim, but a participant in the trick. The joy comes not only from being fooled but from realizing the human hand behind the deception. To see Michelangelo's columns on the Sistine ceiling is to marvel at his skill as much as at the illusion itself. So the question remains, when art deceives in order to delight, is it a falsehood or a form of truth? Perhaps it is both. A ceiling painted with angels does not change the laws of gravity, but it changes the way people experience the room. The deception is obvious, yet it feels right. The line between lie and truth blurs, not because the building hides its structure, but because the painting reshapes the way the structure is perceived. In this case, deception becomes a tool not of fraud but of meaning. It is a lie that reveals, an illusion that deepens reality rather than denying it. The phrase Potemkin village has become shorthand for any display designed to hide reality. The story goes back to the late 18th century, when Prince Grigory Potemkin, a Russian noble and favorite of Catherine the Great, sought to impress her during a tour of newly conquered lands in Crimea. According to legend, he ordered the construction of entire fake villages along her route. These villages were not meant for people to live in. They were stage sets, rows of painted facades propped up along the river banks. When Catherine sailed by, she saw what looked like thriving settlements, complete with happy peasants and cattle. In reality, there was nothing behind the facades. Whether the story is true in detail has long been debated by historians, but its power lies in the image it created. Architecture here was not a shelter or a record of culture. It was propaganda, a lie built from wood and paint to serve political ends. The logic of Potemkin's deception is simple: appearance matters more than substance when power depends on perception. If Catherine believed her empire was flourishing, her authority was confirmed. If foreign visitors believed Russia had modern villages and productive farms, its reputation rose. Architecture became theatre, and truth was sacrificed to spectacle. What mattered was not the experience of the peasants but the view from the Empress's boat. The lie was targeted, and the lie was useful. This story continues to echo in modern practice through what is now called façadism. In many cities, when historic buildings stand in the way of new development, developers preserve only the front facade and demolish everything behind it. The thin outer wall, often a decorated stone or brick frontage, is left standing like a mask. Behind it, glass towers or steel-framed offices rise. From the street, passers-by believe they see continuity, a gesture of respect to history. But the truth is that the original building has been gutted. Only a surface remains, stretched across a new and unrelated structure. The result is neither fully historic nor fully modern, but a hybrid that satisfies preservation laws while serving commercial interests. London offers some of the clearest examples of this practice. In the city's rush to modernize during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, many developers faced rules that prevented them from demolishing listed buildings. To get around the law, they retained the historic facades while rebuilding the interiors into offices, apartments or hotels. One controversial case was at Regent Street, where Georgian facades were held up by steel supports while everything behind them was cleared away. The new buildings rose higher, broader, and shinier, but to the pedestrian eye the street still appeared to preserve its heritage. Preservationists protested, calling it architectural taxidermy, skins of buildings mounted as decoration. Another striking example came with the facade of the Carlton Hotel on Haymarket. The original structure was stripped back until only its grand front wall remained, braced by scaffolding. Behind it, a modern complex took shape. When finished, the street looked as though the hotel still stood, but in truth the rooms, staircases, and details that once gave the building character were gone. The facade had become a costume. To critics, this was not preservation but stagecraft, a Potemkin gesture designed to appease planning authorities and public opinion. Defenders of façadism argue that some compromise is better than total loss. They claim that keeping a facade maintains the rhythm of a historic street, even if the interiors change. They point to the practical need for modern office layouts, energy systems and safety codes, which older buildings cannot easily support. To them, facades serve as a reminder of the past while allowing the city to function in the present. But the debate cuts deeper than convenience. At its heart lies the question of honesty. A facade without substance tells the public that history has been reduced to decoration. The building's voice is silenced, leaving only its mask. Architecture in these cases becomes propaganda once again. Just as Potemkin's villages reassured Catherine about the strength of her empire, facades reassure city councils and citizens that heritage is respected. Yet the truth behind the wall may be something very different: a developer's profit, a set of generic offices, or luxury flats that share little with the history their fronts suggest. The deception works because people see what they expect. A brick frontage from the 19th century triggers the memory of craftsmanship and tradition, even if what lies behind it is glass and drywall. The facade delivers the image of continuity while erasing the substance of it. Consider what happens to collective memory under such conditions. A street lined with preserved facades may convince future generations that they are walking through history. In fact, they are moving through simulations. The knowledge embedded in old construction methods, materials, and room layouts is gone. What remains is a shell that teaches nothing about the past except its outward image. It is like reading only the cover of a book while the pages have been replaced with something else. The danger is that society forgets the difference. Façadism also reveals how power shapes what stories architecture tells. Developers use it to satisfy preservation boards without losing profit. Governments use it to signal care for heritage while still allowing rapid development. In both cases, the surface is enough to persuade the eye. Behind the wall, money and politics dictate the true design. This is why critics compare it to Potemkin's stunt. The purpose is not to provide shelter or beauty, but to craft a narrative that hides the real cost of change. Imagine walking past a row of facades on a street in London. To the eye, it looks like a lively Victorian block. But step inside, and you find a modern office atrium, all steel glass and artificial lighting. The outer layer and the inner reality do not align. The facade tells you one story, the interior tells another. The discord can feel unsettling, even if you cannot name it. You are not sure what you are walking through, history or imitation. The building has turned into a stage set, and you are part of the audience. This uneasy relationship between surface and depth shows how lies in architecture often serve power. They maintain appearances, preserve profit, and reassure the public, all while transforming the reality behind the wall. Just as Catherine the Great was persuaded by rows of painted houses, so modern citizens are persuaded by rows of facades. The deception endures because it works, and because people often prefer the comfort of the story to the truth of what lies behind. Some of the most striking lies in architecture are the ones that never became buildings at all. They exist as drawings, models, and visions that convinced people of futures that never arrived. These are the works of what are sometimes called the paper architects, designers who created detailed plans for structures so ambitious or strange that they could not be built with the materials, money, or politics of their time. On paper, these projects looked like the future. In reality, they remained images, promises of worlds that never came to be. One of the most famous is Tatlin's Tower, designed in 1919 by Vladimir Tatlin, officially called the Monument to the Third International. It was meant to be both a building and a symbol of the new Soviet state. The tower was planned to be taller than the Eiffel Tower, twisting upward in a massive double helix of steel and glass. Inside were to be rotating volumes, a cube for meetings, a pyramid for executive offices, a cylinder for information, each turning at its own speed. The design suggested dynamism, movement, and the endless progress of revolution. Models were built, drawings circulated, and the tower became a symbol of avant-garde possibility, yet it was never constructed. The Soviet Union, in the aftermath of civil war, lacked the resources and technology to build such a colossal structure. The promise remained a sketch, a lie of steel and glass drawn on paper. Another example is the Imperial Monumental Halls and Tower, proposed in 1904 in Berlin. It was imagined as a vast ceremonial building for the German Empire, crowned with a tower taller than any in existence at the time. Inside, the halls would host state functions and military displays, projecting power through sheer scale. Like Tatlin's design, it served as propaganda before it was ever real. It showed the empire's ambition to rival the great monuments of Europe and to project authority through architecture. Yet the tower, like so many grand visions, never rose. War, politics, and changing priorities left it as a drawing. The people who saw it were meant to believe in the empire's strength, even if the strength existed only on paper. These visionary designs demonstrate the lie of promise. They convince viewers that a certain future is possible, that society is moving toward a bold new world. The designs are persuasive because they look complete, as though construction could begin tomorrow. But they exist in the space between reality and imagination. The drawings are arguments as much as they are plans. They sell a story, often one of progress, authority, or utopia. When the structures remain unbuilt, the lie becomes clear. The drawings were not blueprints for reality, but propaganda tools, meant to inspire belief more than to shape stone and steel. Not all architectural deception of this kind remains unbuilt. Sometimes it takes the form of constructed fantasy. Portmeirion in Wales is an unusual case of a village that embraced deception openly. Built by Sir Clough Williams-Ellis over several decades in the 20th century, it is a mix of styles drawn from Mediterranean villages, Baroque gardens, and romantic ruins. Walking through Portmeirion, you see domes, towers, and colourful facades that seem to belong to centuries of history, but none of it is authentic in the traditional sense. The buildings were designed as pastiche, drawing inspiration from many sources but never tied to a single cultural or historical context. Portmeirion was not built to trick residents into thinking they lived in an old town. It was built as an artistic statement, a fantasy environment where the joy of the lie was part of the attraction. Visitors embraced it because it never claimed to be real. Its honesty lay in its openness. This was not heritage but imagination, not history but theatre. This distinction matters. When Tatlin drew his tower, he presented it as the future of a nation. When Williams-Ellis built Portmeirion, he presented it as play. The first is a political lie, using architecture to create belief in a reality that never existed. The second is a conscious fantasy, a lie that admits itself and asks people to join in. Both use architecture as a medium of storytelling, but one risks betrayal while the other invites participation. The danger of visionary architecture lies in its ability to seduce. Consider how many cities have pinned their hopes on utopian plans that never materialized. Grand housing schemes, futuristic transit hubs, and monumental civic centers have often been promised with dazzling renderings and persuasive speeches. When these projects stall, shrink or collapse, the gap between vision and reality exposes the lie. The unbuilt designs linger as reminders of what might have been. They tell us about ambition, about the dreams of their era, but they also tell us about the limits of human capacity and the fragility of political will. Even today, this pattern repeats. Cities release ambitious master plans filled with gleaming towers, sky gardens and futuristic transport systems. Developers circulate images of neighborhoods that seem green, walkable, and harmonious. But often what gets built is smaller, plainer, or entirely abandoned. The lie of promise persists because the drawings do their job. They convince investors, voters, or citizens to believe in a future that may never come. They sell not a building but a vision, and the vision is often enough to gain support. Visionary and impossible architecture shows us that lies in design need not be malicious to be powerful. A drawing of a tower that never rose can still inspire generations of architects and artists. A village like Port Miriam can delight visitors, even as it admits its own fiction. But when visions are sold as destiny rather than fantasy, the line between inspiration and deception blurs. The architecture that exists only on paper can shape minds as much as stone and steel, creating expectations and memories of futures that never were. In that space between plan and reality, the architect becomes not just a designer of buildings but a designer of lies, crafting stories that people live by, even when the structures themselves remain forever unbuilt. The architectural rendering has become one of the most persuasive tools in the modern building industry. For centuries, drawings and models were used to show clients what a structure might look like, but those drawings left space for imagination. They were suggestions, not promises. With the rise of digital technology, renderings have turned into photorealistic images that can make a building appear as though it already exists. Developers present these images to investors, city councils, and the public, asking them to believe in a vision of the future. The power of these images lies in their precision. They do not look like sketches. They look like photographs of buildings that are not yet real. This shift has changed the way architecture is sold. A rendering no longer shows an outline of design intent. It shows families strolling under trees, light glinting off glass, and skies painted in warm colors. The image suggests not only a building, but a lifestyle. The grass is greener, the trees are fuller, and the streets are cleaner than they will ever be. These renderings are not neutral. They are persuasive, designed to generate trust and enthusiasm. They are sales tools, and with them comes the risk of deception. The problem has become so common that critics have begun to highlight the worst offenders. A group known as Architectural Uprising, based in Sweden, organizes what they call the Fake View Awards. Each year they collect examples of renderings that differ sharply from the finished buildings. The images often show elegant towers surrounded by lush greenery, with wide boulevards free of traffic. When the projects are completed, the towers rise in isolation on barren lots, surrounded by highways or concrete plazas. The contrast is striking. The awards are meant to expose the gap between what was promised and what was delivered, reminding the public that renderings are not reality. One case often discussed is Hudson Yards in New York. The renderings showed a gleaming new neighborhood, full of open space and cultural vibrancy. Images of the development displayed generous plazas filled with trees, people, and sunlight. In reality, much of the site is a landscape of glass towers arranged around a hard windswept plaza dominated by a single sculptural staircase called the Vessel. Critics point out that the renderings suggested a new heart for the city, while the final product feels corporate and exclusive. The lie was not in the design alone, but in the way it was presented to the public as something it could never truly be. Dubai offers another example of how renderings can distort. The city is known for ambitious developments advertised with fantastical images. Projects such as the Palm Jumeirah or the World Islands were promoted through renderings that showed thriving communities, lush greenery, and balanced infrastructure. While some projects were completed, others remain half-finished, with many islands uninhabited and barren. Investors and buyers were convinced by images of paradise, but the reality has been empty sand, construction delays and unfulfilled promises. The gap between vision and outcome reveals how renderings can serve as tools of speculation, encouraging investment in dreams that may never materialize. China's so-called ghost cities provide another case. Renderings of vast new urban developments promised modern lifestyles for millions. The images showed bustling streets, glowing towers and parks filled with life. Local governments and developers used these images to justify massive construction projects. Yet many of the cities remain empty, with blocks of apartments and commercial spaces sitting unused. The images created the impression of a demand that did not exist. The deception here was not only visual but economic, with renderings used to convince both officials and citizens of growth that never came. These examples raise a central ethical question: is exaggeration a natural part of design, or is it a form of fraud? Architects might argue that every drawing or rendering involves some degree of imagination. No project can be shown exactly as it will be, because the future is always uncertain. Lighting changes, landscaping evolves, and the way people use space cannot be fully predicted. In this sense, renderings are aspirational. They show the best version of what a project could be. The intent is not to lie but to inspire. On the other hand, the scale of exaggeration often goes far beyond aspiration. When skies are painted pink, trees are added where none will grow, and streets are cleared of cars to make neighborhoods seem idyllic, the rendering crosses into falsehood. When the image is designed to hide shadows, obscure density, or minimize environmental impact, the deception becomes more deliberate. At that point, it is not simply a matter of artistic license, it is a matter of selling something under false pretenses. The ethical line becomes even sharper when public approval is at stake. A city council asked to approve a new development may rely heavily on renderings to judge its impact. If those renderings understate the building's scale or overstate its public space, the council may be voting on an illusion. Citizens asked to support or oppose projects face the same problem. They respond to images that are closer to advertisements than to records of fact. In such cases, the rendering functions less as a design tool and more as propaganda. The digital lie of the rendering fits within a longer tradition of architecture as persuasion, like Potemkin's villages or preserved facades. These images tell a story designed to shape opinion. The difference is that digital tools make the story more convincing than ever before. The precision of the images leaves little room for doubt. People see them as evidence rather than suggestion. That perception gives them enormous influence, but it also places a responsibility on architects and developers. The question is whether they use that power to inform or to mislead. The rise of renderings shows how architecture has moved into a world where appearances can be perfected long before anything is built. Investors, governments, and the public live with visions of places that may never exist as promised. The images are seductive, convincing, and often beautiful, but they can also become lies, telling stories that reality cannot support. The challenge is to recognize when an image is an honest attempt to represent possibility and when it is a crafted fiction meant to hide the truth. Modernism presented itself as the great truth-teller of architecture. Its leaders spoke of stripping away ornament, abandoning imitation, and letting buildings reveal their function and materials without disguise. The slogan, "Truth to Materials," became a rallying cry. Concrete would look like concrete, steel would look like steel, and glass would look like glass. Where earlier styles wrapped plaster in the image of stone or painted wood to mimic marble, modernism promised honesty. The movement declared that beauty would come not from decoration but from clarity and structure. A wall should be appreciated for the brick that formed it, a beam for the steel that held it. The idea was persuasive, especially in the aftermath of the 19th century's excess. Many felt that the ornate surfaces of Victorian design had buried structure under costumes. Modernism offered a new start. Function dictated form. A house was a machine for living, as Le Corbusier put it. Schools, factories, and housing blocks would be designed with efficiency in mind, free of distraction. The rhetoric suggested a clean break from centuries of architectural deception. Yet modernism itself carried its own kind of lies. To begin with, the claim that materials were presented as they are often ignored the ways they were processed. Concrete was not shown raw but smoothed, polished, and carefully controlled. Glass was not simply transparent but arranged to maximize drama. Even the exposed steel beams that were said to be honest often carried paint or coatings to preserve them, giving them a false neutrality. The surfaces that claimed to be truthful were still mediated by design. Honesty itself became a style, and once it was a style it could be manipulated like any other. The marketing of modernism relied heavily on images that told partial truths. Photographs of Bauhaus buildings, for example, often showed them in perfect light, free from the dirt, clutter, and wear that daily life brought. The buildings were presented as timeless machines, smooth and pure, but residents who lived in them experienced a different reality. While white walls were hard to maintain, flat roofs leaked, large windows caused overheating or cold drafts. The ideal of functional honesty was compromised by practical problems. Yet the photographs circulated as though the promise had been fulfilled. In this way, modernism depended on its own propaganda, promoting a dream that often did not match lived experience. The Bauhaus itself became surrounded by myth. The school presented itself as a union of art and industry, forging a new world where design served society as a whole. But many of the objects produced were far too costly for ordinary people. Chairs and lamps celebrated as models of functional design were out of reach for factory workers or clerks. The rhetoric of serving the masses contrasted with the reality of serving elites who could afford to buy the products. The Bauhaus story was one of democracy in design, yet the practice was often closer to luxury. This was a white lie, told to secure cultural authority while masking contradictions. Le Corbusier's visions reveal similar tensions. His designs for urban housing projects promised light, air and open space for all. He argued that high-rise blocks set in green landscapes would liberate people from crowded dark streets. The drawings showed harmonious communities with orderly towers surrounded by gardens. But when similar principles were applied in real projects, the results were often bleak. High-rise estates became isolated, with empty lawns that few used. The very towers meant to create freedom became symbols of alienation. Corbusier's machines for living worked as drawings and models but often failed as homes. The gap between vision and reality became clear, yet the myth of his ideas endured. Minimalism, another branch of modernist influence, carried its own subtle falsehoods. Minimalist buildings and interiors claim purity through reduction. A white room with a single chair suggests honesty and simplicity, yet behind that simplicity often lies complexity. Walls hide layers of insulation, wiring and ducts. Smooth surfaces are achieved through costly construction methods and constant maintenance. What appears effortless is often the result of intense labor and expense. The white lie of minimalism is that it presents itself as natural and obvious when in fact it is highly artificial. Purity is not a lack of design, but an excess of it, carefully concealed. The irony of modernism is that a movement that defined itself against deception used its own forms of deception to gain acceptance. Its leaders denounced past styles as dishonest, yet they promoted their own style with myths and images that concealed flaws. They promised truth to materials while shaping those materials to serve aesthetics. They declared efficiency while producing objects that were impractical for everyday life. They spoke of serving the masses while building monuments admired by elites. In each case, the lie was not blatant but quiet. A white lie that smoothed over contradictions. These contradictions do not erase the achievements of modernism, but they show how even movements that claim honesty cannot escape the logic of persuasion. Architecture must always sell itself, whether to clients, governments, or the public. Modernism sold itself as the end of lies, the final return to truth. But in doing so, it became yet another style with its own fictions. The clean lines and bare walls carried their own stories, stories that were as constructed as the buildings themselves. To walk through a Bauhaus building today is to see both the ideal and the compromise. You see the clean geometry, the open windows, the promise of a new world, but you may also see cracks, leaks and wear. You sense the gap between the photograph that defined the myth and the structure that endured the weather. You see that even honesty can become performance. Modernism's truth was not free of deception. It was simply a new way of telling a story, one that claimed purity while relying on carefully crafted illusions. The human brain is not a mirror. It does not take in the world and display it as a camera might. Instead, it constructs reality from signals, patterns, and guesses. What we see, hear, and feel is stitched together by the brain in ways that keep us alive, but not always in ways that match the truth. In this sense, the brain acts like an architect of illusions. It builds a structure of experience from incomplete materials. It fills gaps, smooths edges, and presents a version of reality that feels solid even when it is stitched together from guesses. This construction can be tested with simple tricks. Look at a drawing of two lines with arrowheads pointing inward on one and outward on the other. The lines are equal, but one looks longer. The brain does not measure, it interprets. It uses context to decide what it sees. The same happens with color illusions, where a gray square looks white when placed on a dark background. The brain edits the input to match expectation. In daily life, this editing keeps us stable, but it also means that perception is never truth. It is always a model. That model is shaped by biases that act like blueprints for how the brain builds its world. Confirmation bias is one of the clearest. It leads us to notice and accept evidence that supports what we already believe while ignoring what challenges us. In architecture, this bias makes us see what we want in a building. If we expect a new housing development to revitalize a neighborhood, we may see fresh paint and clean lines as proof of success, while ignoring the lack of community spaces or the unaffordable rents. The bias builds a story of progress, even when the structure does not deliver. Authority bias is another blueprint. When someone with power or confidence presents information, we are inclined to trust it. In architecture, this means that a famous architect can present a design and have it praised even when its flaws are clear. The confidence of the designer becomes part of the building's aura. A tower may be praised as visionary when built by a master, though the same design by an unknown would be dismissed as impractical. The authority lends the lie weight, making it believable. Sunk cost bias shows how investment shapes perception. Once people commit time, money, or energy to a project, they resist abandoning it even when it fails. Cities that invest in massive developments continue to promote them even when the buildings sit half empty. The cost already spent becomes a reason to believe in the project's worth. The same logic applies in the mind. When we commit to a belief, we bend evidence to protect it. The building still stands, even if it is hollow inside, because we cannot admit the waste. False consensus bias leads us to assume that others share our views. In urban design, this shows up when planners assume that because they admire minimalist glass towers, the public must admire them too. But what pleases a small group may alienate the wider community. The bias smooths over disagreement, convincing us that our preferences are universal. In the mind, this bias builds a world that looks like us, filled with people who think as we do. It creates comfort, but it also creates blindness. These biases resemble architectural deception because they operate through surface and structure. A facade may look historic, and we accept it as genuine just as we accept evidence that supports what we already think. A confident architect may persuade a client with bold drawings, much as authority bias persuades the mind. A half-built utopia may be defended as worth finishing because of the cost already sunk, much like our unwillingness to abandon a belief we have invested in. And when a row of modern towers rises, planners may assume their enthusiasm is shared, ignoring dissent in the same way the mind assumes consensus. Consider how this plays out in daily life. A person buys a house in a new development because the rendering showed parks and cafes. When those amenities never appear, the sunk cost of the mortgage pushes them to defend the choice. They notice the one coffee cart that does exist, and point to it as proof that the vision is real. Their confirmation bias filters out the empty lots. When neighbors agree, the false consensus bias grows. They all tell each other that the neighborhood is thriving, even when visitors see little life. The architecture and the mind work together to sustain a lie. Another example can be seen in public squares dominated by monumental buildings. A government may build a massive hall with columns and domes that project power. Citizens walking through the space feel awe, not because the building is more functional, but because authority bias primes them to associate grandeur with legitimacy. The mind reads the architecture as proof of stability. The lie is not in the stone itself, but in the way expectation shapes perception. The building becomes a tool to guide thought. These patterns show why deception is so hard to resist. The brain is built to prefer stability over truth. Illusions that align with what we expect feel right. Lies that flatter our beliefs or confirm our hopes are easier to accept than truths that disrupt them. Architecture takes advantage of this by aligning its surfaces with our biases. A false facade works because we want the street to feel historic. A clean white tower works because we want to believe in purity and progress. The deception does not fight our mind, it cooperates with it. The danger lies in how easily the brain's shortcuts can be exploited. Just as a building can hide cheap materials behind a noble front, a belief can hide weakness behind confidence. Just as a development can show lush greenery in a rendering, the mind can show us a world filled with people who think as we do. In both cases, the structure feels solid until cracks appear. The recognition of the lie comes late, when the cost of change is high. The brain builds illusions not out of malice but out of need. It must process the world quickly, and so it relies on patterns. Architecture works the same way. It relies on signals, stone for strength, glass for openness, wood for warmth, to tell stories about what buildings are. When those signals are misused, both the brain and the building deceive. The parallel is clear. Perception itself is architecture, and architecture itself is perception. Both shape lies that feel like truth, because both are built to serve stability before clarity. There are lies in architecture that people welcome, and there are lies that people come to resent. The difference often depends on expectation. When we walk into a space built for fantasy, we accept illusion because it offers delight. When we walk into a space promised as a solution to human need, the same kind of illusion can feel like betrayal. The divide between Disneyland and failed housing projects shows how the same tools of deception can create joy in one case and despair in another. Disneyland was built in the mid-20th century as a place where visitors could step into worlds that never existed. Walking through its gates, you move from Main Street, a nostalgic vision of small-town America, into lands of adventure, frontier, and fantasy. Every building is a stage set. The bricks are not real, the castles are hollow, and the streets are designed with forced perspective, so that they appear longer and taller than they are. The entire park is a lie, but it is a lie told openly. No one believes Sleeping Beauty's castle is a medieval fortress. The joy comes from playing along. The deception is part of the contract between designer and visitor. You agree to suspend disbelief, and in return you get wonder. In Disneyland, the lie works because it admits itself. The fantasy is not sold as reality. The visitor knows they are in a park, but the experience of walking through a false frontier town or a make-believe kingdom brings pleasure. The illusion serves its function, which is entertainment. The deception is not malicious. It enriches the visit, creating stories and memories. People return again and again because the fantasy is satisfying. Here, illusion reveals a kind of truth about longing, imagination, and play. Now compare this to the story of Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, one of the most famous failures of public housing in the United States. Built in the 1950s, it was designed according to modernist principles that promised light, air, and efficiency. The renderings showed clean towers set in open landscapes, a vision of urban renewal. Politicians and architects told the public that this project would solve poverty and bring dignity to working families. For a moment, the vision held. The buildings rose as gleaming white blocks, symbols of progress. But within a decade, the illusion collapsed. The towers became overcrowded, maintenance was neglected, and crime grew. Residents found themselves isolated in structures that felt more like warehouses than homes. The lie of Pruitt-Igoe was not in the materials, but in the promise. The design implied that form alone could solve social problems. The architecture told residents they were stepping into a better future. When that future failed to appear, the betrayal was profound. By the 1970s, the towers were demolished in front of television cameras, a dramatic symbol of modernism's broken promise. Unlike Disneyland, Pruitt-Igoe did not ask people to suspend disbelief for play. It asked them to stake their lives on a vision. The illusion of progress became a trap. The contrast between these two cases shows how context changes the moral weight of deception. In entertainment spaces, illusions are embraced because they are framed as temporary and voluntary. You choose to enter Disneyland, knowing the castle is not real. In housing projects, illusions are imposed. Families did not choose Pruitt-Igoe as fantasy. They were told it was a solution, and they had no choice but to live within its walls. The same techniques that create joy in one setting, forced perspective, symbolic forms, promises of community, become harmful when they pretend to answer real needs without delivering. Other examples reinforce this divide. Casinos in Las Vegas recreate Venice, Paris, or ancient Rome, complete with canals, cobblestones, and colonnades. Visitors laugh at the fakeness while enjoying it. The deception succeeds because it is obvious. Nobody is fooled into thinking they are in Italy. By contrast, post-war housing projects across Europe and America often used monumental forms to suggest order and dignity. The residents were meant to feel pride in living among towers and plazas, but when maintenance failed and social support disappeared, the forms felt hollow. The architecture had promised too much, and its failure left scars. The lesson is not that illusion is always wrong. It is that illusion becomes harmful when it makes claims about truth that it cannot sustain. Disneyland never said it was a real town. Pruitt-Igoe said it was the future of housing. The difference is a matter of honesty about intent. Fantasy can be honest about being fantasy, while ideology can disguise itself as fact. The same set of tools, renderings, facades, symbols, can serve play in one case and control in another. The moral question, then, is not whether a lie exists but when it is acceptable. We tolerate, even celebrate, lies that make us happy when we know they are lies. We resent lies that shape our lives while pretending to be truth. Architecture sits at the center of this tension, because every building tells a story. Sometimes the story is about wonder, and sometimes it is about progress. The risk comes when the story overpromises. A painted castle may promise only a smile. A housing tower may promise dignity, community, and opportunity. When it cannot deliver, the disappointment becomes betrayal. It is worth imagining a visitor walking from Disneyland straight into the ruins of Pruitt-Igoe. In one place, the false castle rises above laughing crowds. In the other, the broken shells of modernist towers lie abandoned. Both are products of architecture's power to create belief. One sustains joy because its lie is transparent. The other crumbles because its lie claimed to be truth. The line between delight and betrayal lies not in the deception itself but in how it is framed, accepted, and lived. When people enter knowing the rules, they play along. When they enter expecting reality, they demand more. To move toward an honest future in architecture, we first need to learn how to see lies in the built world. A lie in architecture is not always obvious. It may take the form of a facade that hides a different reality behind it, a rendering that shows a world that will never be built, or a promise that form alone can solve social problems. Recognizing these lies begins with slowing down and asking what the building is telling us. Does the form match the function? Do the materials speak truthfully about what they are? Do the claims made by the designer or developer hold up once the building is lived in? These questions are simple, but they reveal gaps between appearance and reality. Often, lies are most visible in the small details. A beam that looks like timber but is hollow plastic. A stone wall that is only a thin veneer glued to concrete. A plaza that appears lively in a drawing but is empty in practice. These fractures show the difference between story and fact. To recognize them, one must be alert to the mismatch between what is promised and what is experienced. A fracture is not just a flaw, it is a doorway to understanding. When the crack appears, the illusion begins to show its seams. This idea of fractures can be extended into a tool for resisting deception. In psychology, biases guide perception by filling in gaps with what we expect to see. In architecture, false signals do the same. They guide us to believe that something is historic, strong, or communal when it may be none of those things. By learning to notice the fractures, we interrupt that process. A glyph, in this sense, is a mark or sign that points to what is hidden. It could be the scaffolding that holds up a facade long after the original structure has been gutted. It could be the sterile expanse behind a decorative wall that promised vibrancy. These glyphs are signs that the story is incomplete. They help us see through the deception. The question that follows is whether architecture can be both honest and imaginative. Must honesty mean dull repetition, or can buildings tell stories without lying? Some examples suggest that imagination does not require deception. A structure can be inventive while still speaking truthfully about its materials and functions. The Centre Pompidou in Paris, with its exposed pipes and ducts, shows the machinery of the building on the outside. It does not pretend to be something it is not, yet it creates drama and excitement. Similarly, works of contemporary timber architecture show beams and joints openly, celebrating wood for its strength and warmth rather than disguising it. These buildings prove that imagination and honesty can coexist. But the tension is not easy to resolve. Many people still crave nostalgia, grandeur, or fantasy in their surroundings. To deny that desire risks leaving cities sterile. The challenge is to meet those desires without slipping into deception. A theme park can be openly fantastical, inviting people to play along. A housing project, by contrast, must carry truth in its materials and promises. The future of honesty in architecture may lie in being clear about intention. A fantasy should declare itself as fantasy. A civic building should present itself as what it is. When intent and form align, trust is preserved. This issue becomes even sharper in the age of digital technology. Renderings, deepfakes, and virtual environments create hyperreal images that can be more convincing than reality. A developer today can show investors a digital fly-through of a neighborhood complete with trees, shops, and families, even if the land itself is barren. The image looks real, and people believe it. Artificial intelligence can generate endless variations of these images, adjusting skies, materials, and details until they match expectations perfectly. The danger is that the public loses the ability to tell the difference between vision and fact. Hyperreality blurs the line so thoroughly that even experts struggle to separate promise from reality. In such a context, honesty becomes even more valuable. One path forward is transparency about the limits of representation. Instead of presenting perfect images, architects and developers could include context: what is built, what is planned, what is uncertain. Digital tools could be used to simulate not only best-case scenarios but also ordinary conditions, such as how a plaza looks on a rainy day, or how shadows fall in winter. Honesty does not mean abandoning imagination, it means presenting visions alongside their limits. We may also need new cultural habits for reading images. Just as media literacy helps people navigate news and propaganda, visual literacy in architecture could help citizens read renderings critically, recognizing the tricks. Perfect skies, erased traffic, uniform greenery becomes a skill like spotting advertising techniques. Schools, community groups and planning authorities could encourage this literacy, giving the public tools to see fractures in digital illusions. In this way, honesty is not only a task for architects but a shared responsibility. Architecture has always been about more than shelter. It is a way of telling stories about who we are and what we aspire to be. Lies in architecture are powerful because they shape not only the built environment but also the collective imagination. To move toward honesty does not mean rejecting stories. It means choosing stories that are grounded in what can be built, what can be sustained, and what can be lived. Fantasy has its place, but it must be framed as fantasy. Promises must be tested against reality. By learning to see fractures and glyphs, we gain the ability to enjoy imagination without being trapped by it. In the future, as artificial intelligence and digital design make illusions easier to create, the value of authenticity may increase. Buildings that show their structure, reveal their materials, and align their form with their function will stand out as trustworthy. Their honesty will not limit their creativity. Instead, it will give them credibility in a world where deception is cheap and abundant. The honest building may become the rare building, a sign of integrity in both design and culture.